What if I told you that George Washington, the man whose face graces your dollar bill, once spent several hours crammed inside a tree hollow, like some kind of revolutionary squirrel, hiding from enemies who were actively hunting him? Or that Abraham Lincoln walked 20 miles just to return a library book and pay a 6-cent fine? These aren't the stories they taught you in school, are they? See, here's the thing about American presidents. Behind every marble statue and solemn portrait is a real human being who did wonderfully weird, surprisingly relatable things.
And in
They
fulfilling
fought
this
over
task,
goats,
we
collected
will not only
arrowheads,
extend humanity
composed hymns, and yes, occasionally hidden trees when military strategies went sideways. Tonight, we're going to explore 101 completely true, utterly bizarre facts about every single president from Washington to Biden. So grab your coziest blanket, dim those lights, and prepare to discover that the most powerful people in American history were also some of the most delightfully strange. Now get comfortable, and let's dive into the wonderfully weird world of presidential humanity, starting with our tree-hiding founding father, Washington's treehouse, hideout. Picture this: George Washington, future father of our nation, crammed into a tree hollow like some kind of revolutionary squirrel. This wasn't exactly the heroic image they put on the dollar bill, was it? During his first military engagement in 1754, young Washington led a surprise attack on French forces that went about as well as you'd expect from a 22-year-old with more ambition than experience. The native allies of the French didn't appreciate being ambushed and promptly returned the favor. Our future president found himself diving into the nearest tree hollow, spending hours listening to his enemies search for him while probably reconsidering his career choices. The irony is delicious. The man who would later cross the Delaware in legendary fashion once spent an afternoon playing hide and seek with hostile forces, but this embarrassing defeat taught him valuable lessons about wilderness warfare that would serve him well during the Revolution. Sometimes the best education comes from the most humbling experiences. Adams and his golden obsession. Speaking of humble beginnings, John Adams had what you might charitably call an unusual passion. While most people see manure as, well, waste, Adams saw it as literal gold. He founded the Massachusetts Society for Promoting Agriculture because he was absolutely convinced that proper fertilizer was the key to American prosperity. This wasn't just casual farming interest. Adams would write lengthy letters about the virtues of different types of dung with the same enthusiasm most people reserve for discussing their favorite movies. He genuinely believed that agricultural independence was as important as political independence, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely wrong. His obsession with soil improvement bordered on the fanatical, and he'd corner dinner guests to lecture them about crop rotation techniques. Imagine being invited to dine with a founding father only to spend the evening hearing about cow manure. But Adams was onto something profound. A nation that couldn't feed itself couldn't truly be free. His earthy wisdom would prove remarkably prescient. Jefferson's gravestone grammar. Thomas Jefferson, Renaissance man extraordinaire, had some very specific ideas about how he wanted to be remembered. When it came time to design his own gravestone, because of course he designed his own gravestone, he made a fascinating choice. He listed 3 accomplishments: author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Notice what's missing? That little detail about being President of the United States. For Jefferson, being the nation's 3rd president apparently ranked somewhere below founding a university in terms of personal pride. It's like winning an Oscar and not mentioning it on your resume because you're more proud of that community theater production you directed in college. This wasn't false modesty. Jefferson genuinely believed his intellectual and educational contributions would outlast his political achievements. He wanted to be remembered as a thinker and creator, not just another politician. History suggests he might have been right about that particular calculation. Madison's revolutionary drag operation. James Madison, all 5 feet 4 inches of him, had a secret identity during the Revolution that sounds like something out of a spy novel. His code name was Jemmy, and his specialty was an operation so absurd it would make modern intelligence agencies weep with laughter. Madison smuggled gunpowder hidden in women's petticoats, because apparently the 18th century equivalent of hiding contraband in your trunk was stuffing explosives into ladies' undergarments. Picture the future architect of the Constitution, carefully arranging black powder in frilly clothing, while trying not to blow himself up in the process. The scheme worked brilliantly. British soldiers were too polite to thoroughly search ladies' intimate apparel, giving Madison and his fellow revolutionaries the perfect cover. It's impossible to imagine the man who would later pen the Bill of Rights creeping around in drag, but desperate times called for creative measures. This operation perfectly captured Madison's genius for finding practical solutions to seemingly impossible problems, even if those solutions involved cross-dressing and potentially explosive undergarments. Monroe's $1 million insult. James Monroe received what might be history's most expensive insult, and somehow managed to turn it into a dinner party story. Napoleon's agents approached the future president with an offer that would make modern lobbyists blush. $1.5 million to betray American interests during delicate diplomatic negotiations. That's roughly $30 million in today's money, enough to buy a small island or a very large yacht. Monroe's response was beautifully simple. He told them exactly where they could stuff their bribe. But here's the delicious part. Instead of getting offended, Monroe seemed almost amused by the audacity. He'd later regale friends with the tale of how Napoleon thought American integrity had a price tag. The attempted bribe actually strengthened Monroe's resolve and gave him valuable insight into European cynicism about American democracy. It also provided him with an excellent conversation starter for the rest of his life. Nothing says I'm incorruptible quite like turning down enough money to fund a small army. Quincy Adams' secret library. John Quincy Adams took his love of rare books to levels that would make modern collectors weep with envy. His personal library wasn't just extensive, it included a secret compartment specifically designed to house what he diplomatically called forbidden volumes. These weren't necessarily scandalous books, mind you, but works that were considered controversial or politically sensitive for a man in his position. Adams believed that truly understanding the world required reading perspectives that others might find uncomfortable or dangerous. His hidden collection included works on revolutionary theory, critiques of religion, and philosophical treatises that challenged conventional wisdom. The man who would later argue the Amistad case before the Supreme Court understood that intellectual courage sometimes required bibliographic discretion. Imagine the future president sneaking around his own house to read books he thought might expand his mind but scandalize his constituents. It's a beautiful reminder that even in the early republic, thoughtful people understood the difference between public propriety and private intellectual growth. His secret reading list probably contained more wisdom than most modern bestseller collections. Jackson's century of challenges. Andrew Jackson approached conflict resolution with the subtlety of a charging rhinoceros. He challenged over 100 men to duels during his lifetime, which suggests either extraordinary bad luck in social situations or an unusually broad definition of fighting words. Jackson collected insults like some people collect stamps, except instead of putting them in albums, he settled them with pistols at dawn. The man was so famous for dueling that, by his later years, challenging Jackson had become something of a suicide mission. This reputation came in handy when he was 77 years old and an assassin attempted to kill him outside the Capitol. Rather than rely on security, Jackson proceeded to beat his would-be killer with his walking cane until bystanders intervened to protect the assassin, not the president. The image of an elderly Jackson thrashing a younger man with his cane perfectly captured his approach to problem solving. Direct, violent, and surprisingly effective. His cane became as famous as his temper, and both served him well throughout his remarkably contentious life. Some presidents inspire fear through their policies. Jackson inspired it through his willingness to personally beat you unconscious. Van Buren's petticoat politics. Martin Van Buren learned that in politics, sometimes the most dangerous enemies wear evening gowns. His re-election campaign was derailed by what became known as the Petticoat Affair, a scandal so absurd it could have been written by a satirist with a particularly cruel sense of humor. The whole mess started when Jackson's Secretary of War married a widow whose reputation had become the subject of Washington gossip. Cabinet wives, led by Vice President Calhoun's spouse, decided to socially ostracize the new bride, creating a schism that split Jackson's entire administration. Van Buren, ever the political survivor, sided with Jackson and the ostracized couple, which earned him Jackson's gratitude but made him powerful enemies. When Van Buren ran for re-election, his opponents weaponized the gossip, painting him as someone who defended immoral women. The irony was exquisite. Van Buren lost the presidency partly because he'd chosen kindness over political calculation. American voters punished him for refusing to participate in slut-shaming, which tells you everything you need about 19th century moral priorities. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything, and Van Buren learned that lesson the hard way. Harrison's death poem Prophecy. William Henry Harrison possessed either remarkable foresight or the world's worst timing when he composed a poem about his own death shortly before becoming president. The poem reflected on mortality and the brevity of life, themes that would prove uncomfortably prescient when Harrison died just 31 days into his presidency. History records that he died of pneumonia, though modern doctors suspect it was actually typhoid fever, but the real cause hardly matters. What matters is that Harrison somehow sensed his time was running short. The poem wasn't morbid exactly, more contemplative, like someone who'd seen enough of life to understand its fragility. Harrison had spent decades as a soldier and politician, watching friends and enemies alike succumb to disease, violence, and simple bad luck. Perhaps his poetic premonition came from a lifetime of observing how quickly circumstances could change. His death poem became an eerie footnote to the shortest presidency in American history. It's impossible to know whether Harrison truly believed his words, or if they were simply the musings of an aging man who'd lived through enough to appreciate life's uncertainty. Tyler's Texas Gambit. John Tyler accomplished something that sounds impossible in today's political climate. He completely alienated his own party while achieving one of the most significant territorial expansions in the American history. Tyler became president when Harrison died, inheriting a Whig administration despite having Democratic leanings. When he pushed for Texas annexation against his party's wishes, the Whigs expelled him faster than you could say Lone Star State. Tyler found himself a president without a party, supported by neither Whigs nor Democrats, yet somehow managed to orchestrate Texas's entry into the Union through sheer political stubbornness. The annexation was controversial because it would upset the delicate balance between slave and free states. But Tyler believed American expansion was inevitable and preferable to British influence in Texas. His party abandonment left him politically isolated but historically vindicated. Texas annexation proved enormously popular with voters, even if politicians hated it. Tyler demonstrated that sometimes the most important presidential legacies come from defying party orthodoxy. He sacrificed his political future for what he believed was America's destiny, which is either admirable principle or spectacular political miscalculation, depending on your perspective. Polk's one-term promise. James K. Polk made a campaign promise so unusual that modern politicians would consider it career suicide. He pledged to serve only one term and actually meant it. In 1844, Polk promised voters he would accomplish 4 specific goals: reduce tariffs, establish an independent treasury, settle the Oregon boundary dispute, and acquire California, then retire to private life. This wasn't political posturing. Polk genuinely believed that presidents should accomplish their objectives and step aside rather than cling to power. He worked himself nearly to death fulfilling these promises, achieving all four goals in a single term that historians now consider among the most productive in presidential history. True to his word, Polk declined to seek renomination and retired to Tennessee, where he planned to spend his golden years reading ancient histories and writing memoirs. Unfortunately, he died just 3 months after leaving office, exhausted by the pace he'd maintained throughout his presidency. Polk proved that political promises don't have to be empty gestures, but the cost of keeping them can be extraordinarily high. His one-term presidency accomplished more than many two-term administrations, suggesting that urgency might be the secret ingredient to effective governance. Taylor's Democratic debut. Zachary Taylor achieved something that would be impossible today. He became president before ever casting a vote in his life. Taylor spent 40 years as a career military officer, moving from post to post without establishing legal residency anywhere long enough to participate in elections. Military men in the 19th century often avoided politics entirely, viewing civilian governance as outside their professional purview. Taylor didn't vote until he was 62 years old, and that first ballot was cast for himself as president. Imagine the cognitive dissonance of participating in democracy for the first time as its chief executive. Taylor's political innocence was both his greatest asset and his fatal weakness. Voters trusted him precisely because he had no political track record, but his inexperience with civilian governance created constant friction with Congress. He approached the presidency like a military campaign, expecting orders to be followed and problems to be solved through direct action rather than negotiation. His late entry into Democratic participation symbolized the tension between military and civilian authority that has shaped American politics since the founding. Taylor proved that political experience might be less important than personal integrity, though his early death prevented a full test of that theory. Fillmore's academic legacy. Millard Fillmore founded the University of Buffalo, though he'd probably prefer that history forget some of his other organizational affiliations. Fillmore's educational legacy stands as his most admirable achievement, creating an institution that would serve thousands of students for generations. He believed that education was the foundation of democratic society and invested considerable personal time and money in establishing a university that could compete with Eastern elite institutions. However, Fillmore also became involved with the Know Nothing Party, an anti-immigrant political movement that contradicted the inclusive spirit of his educational work. The irony is striking. A man who founded a university that welcomed students regardless of background simultaneously supported a party that wanted to exclude immigrants from American society. Fillmore's contradictory impulses reflected the tensions of his era, when American identity was still being defined and refined. His university survived and thrived long after the Know Nothing Party disappeared into historical obscurity, suggesting that his better angels ultimately prevailed. Sometimes people's finest legacies emerge from their noblest impulses, while their worst tendencies fade into irrelevance. Fillmore's academic vision outlasted his political prejudices, which might be the best epitaph any flawed leader could hope for. Pierce's popular sovereignty disaster. Franklin Pierce thought he'd found the perfect solution to America's slavery crisis. Let each territory decide for itself whether to allow slavery, a concept called popular sovereignty. This idea sounds democratic and reasonable until you realize it essentially meant opening every new territory to civil war. Pierce genuinely believed that local self-determination would somehow magically solve the moral and economic contradictions of slavery, which was like trying to fix a broken dam with wishful thinking and good intentions. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which implemented Pierce's popular sovereignty approach, turned the Kansas Territory into Bleeding Kansas, a preview of the National Civil War that would come 6 years later. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, each side determined to win the territorial elections through any means necessary, including violence. Pierce watched in horror as his elegant political solution devolved into guerrilla warfare and massacres. His presidency became defined by this single policy failure, proving that some moral questions can't be resolved through compromise or procedural cleverness. Pierce learned too late that slavery was an issue requiring moral clarity, not political finesse. His popular sovereignty experiment demonstrated that some problems require decisive leadership rather than democratic dithering. Buchanan's transatlantic toast. James Buchanan had the honor of sending the first transatlantic cable message, and he used this revolutionary technology to propose a toast to Queen Victoria. In 1858, after years of failed attempts to lay a telegraph cable across the Atlantic Ocean, engineers finally succeeded in connecting Europe and North America with nearly instantaneous communication. This technological miracle promised to revolutionize international relations, commerce, and diplomacy. When the moment came to inaugurate this new era with the first presidential message, Buchanan chose courtesy over gravitas. His message was essentially cheers to the Queen, which was diplomatically appropriate but historically underwhelming. The cable worked for only a few weeks before failing, but during that brief window, it carried messages that seemed almost magical to people accustomed to waiting weeks for transatlantic communication. Buchanan's polite toast symbolized the genteel diplomatic culture of his era, when international relations still followed 18th century protocols despite 19th century innovations. His message might have lacked dramatic flair, but it established the precedent that new technologies should serve peaceful communication rather than military advantage. Sometimes the most important historical moments are marked by quiet politeness rather than grand gestures. Lincoln's library, fine. Abraham Lincoln once walked 20 miles to return an overdue library book, which might be the most Lincoln story ever recorded. The future president had borrowed a biography of George Washington and accidentally let it get damaged when rain leaked through his cabin roof. Rather than ignore the problem or make excuses, Lincoln walked to the library, confessed the damage, and paid the replacement cost plus a 6-cent fine. This incident perfectly captured Lincoln's character. Meticulous attention to personal obligations, respect for education and books, and willingness to accept responsibility for his mistakes. The 20-mile round trip wasn't just about returning a book. It was about maintaining his reputation for honesty in a community where trust was the only currency that mattered. Lincoln understood that small acts of integrity build the foundation for larger moral authority. His willingness to walk 40 miles total for a 6-cent fine seems absurd until you realize he was investing in something more valuable than money: his credibility. This library story became part of his political mythology because it demonstrated the character traits that would later enable him to hold the Union together. Sometimes the smallest gestures reveal the deepest truths about a person's values. Johnson's goat fight glory. Andrew Johnson once fought a man with a knife over a stolen goat, won the encounter, and kept the scar as a badge of honor. This wasn't political metaphor. Johnson literally engaged in single combat over livestock theft and considered the resulting wound a mark of personal courage. The incident occurred during Johnson's youth in Tennessee, when personal honor was often defended through violence, and community justice frequently bypassed formal legal channels. Johnson's willingness to risk his life over a goat tells you everything about his character. Stubborn, prideful, and absolutely unwilling to back down from a fight. The scar became part of his personal mythology, proof that he'd never allowed anyone to steal from him without consequence. This knife-fighting experience might have prepared him for the political battles of his presidency when he faced impeachment proceedings with the same stubborn determination he'd shown defending his livestock. Johnson approached politics like personal combat. Every disagreement was a challenge to his honor that required a fierce response. His goat fighting scar symbolized his entire approach to leadership: direct, violent when necessary, and utterly uncompromising. Sometimes the smallest incidents reveal the most important truths about how someone handles conflict under pressure. Grant's desk, cat diplomacy, Ulysses S. Grant, adopted a stray cat named Landing that apparently had better diplomatic instincts than most of his advisors. The cat made itself at home on Grant's desk during important peace negotiations, providing what might have been the most relaxed atmosphere ever achieved during high-stakes international discussions. There's something beautifully absurd about imagining foreign diplomats trying to maintain serious conversation while a cat walks across treaty documents and purrs through territorial negotiations. Landing became an unofficial member of Grant's administration, attending meetings and apparently offering silent commentary on policy decisions. Grant's affection for the cat revealed a gentle side of his personality that contrasted sharply with his reputation as a fierce military commander. The presence of a pet during serious government business might seem unprofessional, but Landing probably contributed more to peaceful relations than most formal diplomatic protocols. Animals have a way of reducing tension and humanizing even the most powerful people, reminding everyone that leadership requires both strength and tenderness. Grant's willingness to let a stray cat participate in presidential duties suggests a man comfortable with his authority and secure enough to show vulnerability. Sometimes the most effective diplomacy involves creating an environment where everyone can relax their guard slightly. Hayes's whiskey ring pardons Rutherford. Hayes pardoned 75% of the whiskey ring conspirators, which was either remarkable mercy or spectacular political miscalculation. The whiskey ring was a massive tax evasion scheme involving distillers and federal revenue agents who conspired to avoid paying taxes on alcohol production. These weren't small-time bootleggers. They were organized criminals who cost the federal government millions in lost revenue. Hayes inherited prosecutions that had already secured convictions against dozens of conspirators, but he decided that national healing required forgiveness rather than punishment. His pardons were controversial precisely because they seemed to reward corruption, but Hayes believed that excessive punishment would perpetuate the cynicism that enabled corruption in the first place. He argued that showing mercy would encourage future cooperation with law enforcement and demonstrate that the federal government was more interested in preventing crime than seeking revenge. Critics accused him of being soft on corruption, but Hayes saw his pardons as an investment in future reform. His whiskey pardons reflected a fascinating philosophical approach to criminal justice. Sometimes forgiveness achieves more than punishment. Whether Hayes was naive or wise depends on your perspective about human nature and the role of mercy in governance. Garfield's self-taught. Greek James Garfield taught himself ancient Greek, using nothing but a lexicon while plowing fields as a teenager, which might be the most impressively nerdy agricultural achievement in presidential history. Picture a farm boy stopping his plow to look up Greek vocabulary, then continuing his furrows while conjugating irregular verbs. Garfield's linguistic ambitions weren't just academic showing off. He genuinely believed that understanding classical languages was essential for comprehending Western civilization. His self-directed Greek education represented the kind of intellectual hunger that characterized 19th century American democracy, when ambitious young people could educate themselves through sheer determination and access to books. Garfield would later become the only president who could write in Greek and Latin simultaneously, using different hands for each language. His teenage Greek studies prepared him for a career in education and politics, proving that intellectual curiosity could be more valuable than formal credentials. The image of Garfield plowing and parsing Greek verbs captures the democratic ideal that knowledge belongs to anyone willing to pursue it. His agricultural Greek lessons demonstrated that true education happens when someone desperately wants to learn, regardless of their circumstances. Sometimes the most profound learning occurs in the most unlikely settings. Arthur's midnight cabinet shenanigans. Chester Arthur took the concept of after hours government meetings to delightfully shady levels with his infamous midnight cabinet. These weren't official policy sessions, mind you, but secret gatherings where Arthur and his cronies could plot ways to circumvent the civil service reforms that were cramping their patronage style. Picture the president sneaking around his own White House like a teenager avoiding curfew, hosting clandestine meetings with political allies who were equally committed to preserving the spoils system. Arthur had inherited the presidency after Garfield's assassination, and reformers expected him to continue his predecessor's anti-corruption crusade. Instead, he decided that civil service reform was more of a suggestion than a mandate. His midnight meetings became Washington's worst-kept secret, with participants arriving at odd hours through various entrances to avoid detection. These nocturnal strategy sessions perfectly captured the twilight of machine politics in America. Cleveland's strike and starvation contradiction. Speaking of contradictory leadership decisions, Grover Cleveland managed to demonstrate both iron-fisted authority and heartless indifference within the same presidency. When railroad workers went on strike in 1894, Cleveland deployed federal troops to break the labor action, arguing that mail delivery and interstate commerce couldn't be disrupted by worker grievances. His decisive military intervention earned praise from business leaders who appreciated his willingness to prioritize economic stability over worker rights. But then Cleveland turned around and vetoed a bill that would have provided federal aid to farmers suffering through a devastating drought in Texas. Apparently, Cleveland believed the federal government had a responsibility to protect corporate profits, but not to prevent citizens from starving. The contradiction was stunning. Cleveland would use federal power to break strikes, but not to distribute emergency food supplies. His selective interpretation of federal authority reflected the laissez-faire philosophy of his era, when government intervention was acceptable for protecting business, but unconscionable for helping the poor. Harrison's billion-dollar budget backlash. Benjamin Harrison achieved something that sounds mundane today, but scandalized 19th century America. He signed the first billion-dollar federal budget. In 1890, spending $1 billion seemed like an astronomical waste that would bankrupt the nation and corrupt the federal government through excessive largesse. Critics dubbed Congress the billion-dollar Congress, as if federal spending had reached pornographic levels of indecency. Harrison defended the budget by arguing that America was a billion-dollar country that deserved billion-dollar governance, which was actually a pretty good comeback. The spending went toward infrastructure, naval expansion, and veteran pensions, investments that would prove enormously beneficial for national development. But voters were horrified by the price tag and voted Harrison out of office, proving that fiscal conservatism was more popular than national improvement. The billion-dollar budget controversy revealed the tension between America's growing global ambitions and its traditional penny-pinching mentality. Sometimes visionary leadership requires spending money that makes voters nervous, even when the investments prove worthwhile. McKinley's gold standard gamble. William McKinley created what became known as the Gold Standard Panic through his 1900 Currency Act that tied American money exclusively to gold, effectively destroying the silver-based economy overnight. This wasn't just monetary policy, it was economic warfare against entire regions of the country that depended on silver mining and bimetallic currency systems. McKinley believed that gold-backed currency would stabilize international trade and attract foreign investment, which wasn't entirely wrong, but the transition devastated silver-producing states and agricultural communities that relied on cheaper, more flexible currency. The act essentially chose financial stability over regional equity, prioritizing international credibility over domestic harmony. Silver miners watched their life savings become worthless as silver prices collapsed, while farmers found it harder to pay debts with more expensive gold-backed dollars. McKinley's gold standard represented the triumph of industrial capitalism over agrarian democracy, marking America's evolution from an agricultural republic to a global financial power. The policy worked exactly as intended, but the human cost was enormous. Roosevelt's bulletproof speech. Theodore Roosevelt redefined the phrase, "the show must go on," when he delivered a full campaign speech after being shot in the chest by an assassin in Milwaukee. The bullet hit his steel glasses case and the folded speech manuscript in his coat pocket, which slowed the projectile just enough to prevent it from reaching his heart. Any reasonable person would have gone to the hospital immediately, but Roosevelt wasn't particularly reasonable about anything, especially when it came to his own mortality. Instead, he climbed onto the stage, announced to the crowd that he'd been shot, and proceeded to speak for 90 minutes while bleeding into his shirt. The speech began with the immortal line, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose," which perfectly captured Roosevelt's approach to both politics and personal danger. His refusal to let an assassination attempt interrupt his campaign schedule became legendary, cementing his reputation as the most physically fearless president in American history. Roosevelt proved that sometimes the best response to violence is simply refusing to be intimidated. Taft's presidential pitching, William Howard Taft, brought baseball to the White House in the most literal way possible, organizing regular games with his cabinet members and reportedly pitching a no-hitter during one particularly memorable contest. Picture the 300-pound president winding up to deliver fastballs to his Secretary of State, turning diplomatic meetings into sporting events where policy discussions happened between innings. Taft's love for baseball wasn't just recreational. He genuinely believed that athletic competition built character and fostered better working relationships among his staff. His cabinet baseball games became legendary in Washington, with administration officials trading their formal attire for uniforms and competing with the intensity they usually reserved for legislative battles. Taft himself was surprisingly athletic despite his size, using his bulk to his advantage as a pitcher who could intimidate batters through sheer physical presence. The image of cabinet secretaries sliding into home plate while the president called balls and strikes perfectly captured Taft's informal approach to leadership. Sometimes the best way to build team unity is through shared athletic humiliation. Wilson's hypochondriac hygiene. Woodrow Wilson took personal cleanliness to levels that would make modern germaphobes seem relaxed, reportedly taking up to 10 baths per day during his presidency, because he was convinced that germs were constantly plotting his demise. This wasn't just presidential privilege. Wilson genuinely feared that contamination would compromise his ability to lead the nation through the World War I and the complex peace negotiations that followed. His obsessive bathing routine became a White House logistics nightmare, with staff scrambling to keep enough hot water available for the president's frequent cleansing rituals. Wilson's hypochondria reflected the era's limited understanding of disease transmission. When many people believed that vigorous washing could prevent everything from influenza to moral corruption, his bath schedule was so rigid that diplomatic meetings had to be planned around his hygiene requirements, which must have confused foreign dignitaries who weren't familiar with American presidential bathing protocols. Wilson's fear of germs ironically proved somewhat prescient. He did suffer a major stroke that left him partially incapacitated during his final years in office, though excessive bathing probably didn't prevent it. Harding's secret poetry career. Warren G. Harding maintained a secret identity as a romantic poet, publishing verses about lost love under a pseudonym because apparently being president wasn't emotionally fulfilling enough. His poetry wasn't particularly good. Think Hallmark card sentiment with slightly better meter, but it revealed a surprisingly tender side of his personality that contrasted sharply with his public image as a glad-handing political operator. Harding's romantic verses often dealt with themes of longing and regret, which probably reflected his complicated personal life and the various extramarital relationships that kept Washington gossips busy. His decision to publish anonymously suggests that He understood the political risk of being seen as overly sentimental. Though the irony is delicious, voters might have preferred a president who wrote bad poetry to one who engaged in corruption and cronyism. Harding's secret literary career provided him with an emotional outlet that his public duties couldn't satisfy. Sometimes even presidents need creative hobbies to maintain their sanity, even if those hobbies involve writing terrible rhymes about unrequited love. Coolidge's electric horse therapy. Calvin Coolidge dealt with chronic indigestion by riding an electric horse installed in the White House, which might be the most surreal presidential medical treatment in American history. This wasn't some quaint antique. Electric horses were actually prescribed by doctors in the 1920s as treatment for digestive problems, based on the theory that mechanical motion could stimulate proper gastric function. Picture silent Cal bouncing up and down on his therapeutic horse while contemplating federal policy and trying not to look ridiculous. The machine was apparently quite popular with White House visitors, who were occasionally invited to take rides when Coolidge wasn't using it for his medical sessions. His electric horse therapy sessions became part of his daily routine, scheduled between official meetings and ceremonial duties like any other presidential obligation. The image of America's most laconic president riding a mechanical horse in the executive mansion perfectly captured the intersection of traditional authority and modern technology that characterized the 20s. Sometimes the most effective medicine comes in the most absurd packages: Hoover's childhood dam disaster. Herbert Hoover's engineering instincts manifested early when he built a mini dam as a child that briefly flooded his hometown, providing a preview of both his technical brilliance and his talent for unintended consequences. Young Hoover was fascinated by hydraulic engineering and decided to apply his theoretical knowledge to the creek that ran through his Iowa community. His dam worked exactly as designed. Unfortunately, he hadn't fully considered the downstream effects of redirecting that much water at once. The resulting flood was more embarrassing than destructive, but it taught Hoover valuable lessons about the importance of considering all variables before implementing engineering solutions. This childhood incident perfectly foreshadowed his presidential approach to the Great Depression, when his faith in technical expertise sometimes blinded him to the human consequences of economic policies. Hoover's flooded hometown became a metaphor for his entire career. Brilliant engineering that occasionally created problems for everyone else. Sometimes even the smartest solutions can produce unexpected complications that require additional expertise to resolve properly. Roosevelt's naval print collection, Franklin D. Roosevelt amassed over 1,000 naval prints in his White House study. And this wasn't just presidential collecting. His maritime artwork actually influenced D-Day invasion planning in ways that naval historians still find remarkable. Roosevelt's lifelong fascination with naval history gave him an intuitive understanding of amphibious operations that proved invaluable during World War II strategic discussions. His collection included detailed prints of historical naval battles, ship designs, and coastal fortifications that provided visual references during military planning sessions. Roosevelt would often point to specific prints while discussing invasion strategies, using historical examples to illustrate tactical principles and potential challenges. His naval artwork collection became an unofficial reference library that informed some of the war's most important strategic decisions. The president's hobby turned out to have serious military applications when American forces needed to understand the complexities of large-scale amphibious assault. Roosevelt's prints demonstrated that sometimes the most useful expertise comes from unexpected sources, and that passion projects can develop into professional assets. His collection proved that there's no such thing as useless knowledge when you're planning the liberation of Europe. Truman's time zone clock. Harry Truman installed a 4-face clock in the Oval Office that displayed different time zones simultaneously, because apparently being president wasn't complicated enough without constantly calculating what time it was everywhere else in the world. Each face showed a different strategic location: Washington, London, Moscow, and Tokyo, allowing Truman to coordinate global communications without constantly doing mental arithmetic. This wasn't just convenience. It was practical necessity for a president managing post-war reconstruction, the Cold War, and nuclear diplomacy across multiple continents. Truman's clock symbolized America's emergence as a global superpower with responsibilities that transcended traditional business hours and geographical boundaries. The four faces reminded everyone who entered the Oval Office that presidential decisions now had worldwide consequences that required round the clock attention. His time zone clock became a physical representation of American global leadership, showing visitors that the president was always aware of what was happening around the world. Sometimes the most important technological innovations are the ones that help leaders stay connected to their expanding responsibilities. Eisenhower's ketchup obsession. Dwight Eisenhower's love affair with ketchup reached legendary proportions when he reportedly ordered it served on everything, including ice cream at formal state dinners, which must have horrified both his chefs and visiting dignitaries. This wasn't just casual condiment preference. Eisenhower was genuinely committed to putting ketchup on foods that had never been intended to accommodate tomato-based enhancement. His culinary choices reflected his Kansas upbringing, where practical nutrition mattered more than sophisticated flavor combinations. State dinner menus had to be planned around the president's ketchup requirements, which probably created diplomatic incidents with food-conscious foreign leaders who weren't prepared for American presidential eating habits. Eisenhower's ketchup enthusiasm became part of his public persona, reinforcing his image as a plain-spoken leader who hadn't been corrupted by Washington's sophistication. His willingness to put ketchup on ice cream demonstrated the kind of fearless decision-making that had served him well during World War II. Sometimes the most revealing presidential characteristics emerged through their strangest personal habits. Kennedy's Cuban cigar smuggling John F. Kennedy demonstrated remarkable cognitive dissonance when he smuggled Cuban cigars into the White House during the Cuban Missile Crisis, effectively violating his own trade embargo for the sake of his personal smoking preferences. Kennedy dispatched his press secretary to acquire a large supply of Cuban cigars just hours before signing the embargo that would make such purchases illegal, which suggests either impressive forward planning or spectacular hypocrisy. The president apparently believed that nuclear brinksmanship was stressful enough without having to sacrifice his favorite tobacco products for the sake of diplomatic consistency. His cigar smuggling operation required careful coordination to avoid political embarrassment, since Kennedy couldn't exactly explain why he was stockpiling the same Cuban products that American citizens were now forbidden to purchase. The irony was delicious. Kennedy was literally smoking the enemy's cigars while contemplating nuclear war against their government. His tobacco smuggling revealed the very human tendency to maintain personal comforts, even when advocating policies that require sacrifice from everyone else. Sometimes even presidents prioritize their personal preferences over their public principles. Johnson's personal car fleet. Lyndon Johnson owned and personally drove a fleet of cars around his Texas ranch, consistently ignoring Secret Service protocols that were designed to keep presidents alive rather than satisfied with their automotive independence. Johnson's car collection included everything from practical ranch vehicles to high-performance luxury automobiles, and he insisted on driving them himself despite the obvious security risks. His Secret Service detail spent most of their time chasing after a president who treated speed limits and safety protocols as suggestions rather than requirements. Johnson's driving habits reflected his larger-than-life personality and his refusal to let presidential responsibilities limit his personal freedom. He would regularly terrify passengers by driving at excessive speeds while conducting important phone conversations and pointing out landmarks on his property. His automotive enthusiasm became legendary among Washington insiders who knew that riding with Johnson required both courage and strong stomach medication. The image of a sitting president racing around his ranch while Secret Service agents pursued him perfectly captured Johnson's approach to authority. He would follow rules when convenient, but ignore them when they interfered with his personal preferences. Nixon's one-way mirror surveillance. Richard Nixon installed a one-way mirror in the White House that allowed him to observe staff members without their knowledge. turning the executive mansion into something resembling a psychology experiment crossed with a police interrogation facility. This wasn't paranoid speculation. Nixon genuinely believed that his own staff might be disloyal and required constant surveillance to ensure their trustworthiness. The mirror system allowed him to monitor conversations and evaluate employee behavior without revealing his presence, which must have created an atmosphere of constant tension among White House personnel. Nixon's surveillance obsession extended beyond simple security concerns into what can only be described as presidential voyeurism, motivated by deep-seated insecurity about staff loyalty. His one-way mirror represented the culmination of an administration that viewed every interaction as potentially threatening and every conversation as requiring documentation or observation. The mirror system perfectly symbolized Nixon's relationship with his own government. He was simultaneously the leader and the most suspicious observer of his own administration. Sometimes the most dangerous threats to presidential authority come from within the president's own mind. Ford's Watergate bread therapy. Gerald Ford discovered that baking bread from scratch provided therapeutic relief during the Watergate crisis, and he shared his homemade loaves with neighbors as a way of maintaining normal human connections during an extraordinarily abnormal political period. Ford's bread baking wasn't just hobby. It was psychological necessity that helped him process the trauma of inheriting a presidency destroyed by scandal and corruption. The physical act of kneading dough and waiting for bread to rise provided a meditative routine that contrasted sharply with the chaos of Watergate aftermath and congressional investigations. His neighbors in suburban Washington began expecting regular deliveries of presidential bread, creating informal diplomatic relationships that helped Ford stay grounded during his unprecedented transition to power. Ford's baking therapy demonstrated that even presidents need practical activities that produce tangible, positive results when their professional responsibilities feel overwhelming and destructive. His bread sharing created small moments of normalcy that reminded everyone involved that politics hadn't completely destroyed basic human decency. Sometimes the most important presidential activities happen outside the Oval Office. Carter's house building at 85. Jimmy Carter hammered the final nail into his own house at age 85, proving that some people respond to aging by becoming more determined rather than more careful about physical challenges. Carter's construction project wasn't symbolic gesture. He genuinely built substantial portions of his post-presidential residence using traditional carpentry techniques and refusing assistance when he could handle tasks independently. The image of an octogenarian former president wielding construction tools while maintaining precise measurement standards perfectly captured Carter's approach to life after the White House. His house-building project required months of physical labor that would challenge people half his age, but Carter treated it as personal obligation rather than impressive achievement. The final nail ceremony marked the completion of a project that demonstrated remarkable physical stamina and mental determination. Carter's construction work proved that presidential retirement doesn't have to mean retreat from demanding physical activities or meaningful personal projects. Sometimes the most satisfying accomplishments happen long after the spotlight has moved elsewhere. Reagan's joke file system. Ronald Reagan memorized over 4,000 jokes and maintained a sophisticated card filing system that allowed him to access precisely timed humor for any speaking occasion, turning comedy into a political science that could be measured and perfected. Reagan's joke collection wasn't casual entertainment. It was professional equipment that he used to connect with audiences and diffuse political tension through carefully calibrated laughter. His filing system organized jokes by topic, audience type, and duration, allowing him to customize his humor for specific events and time constraints. Reagan would spend hours practicing joke timing and studying audience reactions to determine which material worked most effectively in different situations. His comedy expertise became a crucial component of his political success, proving that humor could be more persuasive than traditional rhetorical techniques. The president's joke cards were treated with the same seriousness as policy briefings because Reagan understood that making people laugh was often more important than making them think. Sometimes the most effective political communication involves entertainment rather than education, and Reagan mastered that distinction better than any modern president. Bush's thank you note marathon. George H.W. Bush wrote personal thank you notes to every single person who sent him correspondence during his presidency, ultimately responding to over 100,000 letters with handwritten replies that turned the White House into something resembling a greeting card factory. This wasn't just political courtesy. Bush genuinely believed that every American who took time to write to their president deserved a personal response, regardless of whether they supported his policies or criticized his decisions. His thank you note obsession required enormous time and energy that could have been spent on traditional presidential duties, but Bush considered personal correspondence a sacred obligation that connected him directly with citizens. White House staff had to develop elaborate systems for managing the president's letter-writing schedule, ensuring he had sufficient time each day to maintain his perfect response rate. Bush's handwritten notes became treasured keepsakes for recipients who never expected personal acknowledgement from the most powerful person in America. His correspondence marathon demonstrated that sometimes the most important presidential work involves individual human connections rather than grand policy initiatives. Clinton's literary marathon. Bill Clinton consumed over 300 books per year during his presidency, which means he was basically a speed reading machine disguised as a politician. We're talking about roughly one book every day and a quarter, folks. Most presidents struggled to read their daily briefings, but Clinton was devouring novels, biographies, and policy papers like a literary vacuum cleaner. He favored thrillers and mysteries, often reading Tom Clancy novels between budget meetings. The truly obsessive part? Clinton annotated everything in the margins, scribbling policy ideas inspired by fictional scenarios. His reading habits were so notorious that publishers would send him advance copies, hoping for presidential endorsements. Staff learned to schedule reading time into his daily routine, treating books like essential medicine. Of course, Clinton wasn't the only president with unusual collecting habits that revealed surprising aspects of his personality. Bush's baseball treasure trove. George W. Bush collected antique baseballs with the dedication of a museum curator, amassing a collection that would make Cooperstown jealous. His Crawford Ranch became a shrine to America's pastime, with signed balls from legends like Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig displayed alongside more obscure treasures from forgotten minor leagues. Bush's collecting wasn't just nostalgia. He genuinely understood baseball history and could recite statistics from games played decades before his birth. Each ball told a story, and Bush loved sharing those stories with visitors, transforming casual ranch tours into impromptu baseball history lessons. The collection reflected his deep appreciation for American traditions and his belief that sports revealed character better than politics. His baseball obsession provided a welcome escape from presidential pressures, connecting him to simpler times when heroes wore pinstripes and solved problems with skillful play rather than complex legislation. Obama's daily court sessions. Barack Obama practiced basketball religiously during his presidency, treating the White House court like his personal chapel of athletic meditation. Every morning, weather permitting, Obama would shoot hoops with staff members, Secret Service agents, or visiting dignitaries who happened to possess adequate jump shots. His commitment to daily practice wasn't just exercise. It was therapy, strategy session, and competitive outlet rolled into one sweaty package. Obama once scored 50 points in a pickup game against professional players, proving that his skills weren't just presidential politeness. The basketball court became an unofficial diplomatic venue where foreign leaders could bond with the president over shared athletic struggle. His daily practice routine demonstrated the discipline that characterized his entire approach to governance, treating physical fitness as essential preparation for mental challenges. Sometimes the most important presidential meetings happened during timeouts rather than formal conferences. Trump's fedora fashion statement. Donald Trump amassed a collection of over 50 fedoras from different countries during his presidency, turning diplomatic visits into hat hunting expeditions. Each fedora represented a different nation's craftsmanship, from Italian silk line classics to Australian wool outback styles. Trump's hat obsession wasn't just personal vanity, he genuinely appreciated the craftsmanship and cultural significance of traditional headwear. His collection became a conversation starter during international meetings, with foreign leaders often presenting custom fedoras as diplomatic gifts. The hats were displayed in a special White House room that Trump would enthusiastically show to visitors, explaining the origin and significance of each piece. His fedora collection reflected a surprisingly deep appreciation for artisanal traditions and international cultural exchange. Trump's passion for hats provided unexpected common ground with leaders from diverse backgrounds, proving that sometimes the smallest shared interests can bridge the largest political gaps. Biden's children's book, Legacy. Joe Biden wrote a children's book titled Don't Forget, God Bless Our Troops, inspired by his son, Beau's military service, and his own deep respect for armed forces families. The book wasn't a political statement, but a heartfelt tribute to the sacrifices made by military families, written with the simple clarity that children could understand and adults could appreciate. Biden's motivation came from watching his son deploy to Iraq and understanding the emotional weight carried by families left behind. The book featured gentle illustrations and straightforward language that honored military service without glorifying war itself. Biden donated all proceeds to military family support organizations, treating the project as service rather than profit opportunity. His children's book demonstrated the personal dimension of policy decisions, reminding readers that behind every military deployment are real families facing real separation. Sometimes the most important messages are simple enough for children to grasp, but profound enough to move adults to tears. Washington's minuet mastery, but of course, our presidential predecessors had talents that extended far beyond their political achievements. George Washington was renowned as Virginia's finest dancer, particularly skilled in the minuet, which was basically the 18th century equivalent of being a ballroom champion. Martha Washington frequently boasted that her husband was the best dancer in Virginia, which was serious praise in a society where social dancing was both art form and political networking opportunity. Washington's graceful footwork served him well at diplomatic gatherings, where European ambassadors expected American leaders to demonstrate cultural sophistication alongside political acumen. His dancing skills weren't just social niceties, they were essential diplomatic tools that helped establish America's credibility among skeptical foreign courts. The minuet required precision, timing, and partnership, qualities that translated perfectly to political leadership. Washington understood that presidents must perform on multiple stages, and sometimes the most important performances happen in ballrooms rather than battlefields. Adams's educational vision. Speaking of founding fathers with unexpected passions, John Adams spent considerable energy arguing for a national university that would rival Europe's greatest institutions of learning. His vision wasn't just academic. Adams believed that American democracy required an educated citizenry capable of intelligent self-governance. He proposed establishing a university that would train future leaders in science, philosophy, and practical governance, funded by federal resources and open to talented students regardless of their economic background. Adams's educational advocacy ultimately contributed to the founding of George Washington University, though not during his lifetime. His commitment to education reflected his deep belief that knowledge was democracy's greatest protection against tyranny and corruption. Adams understood that political independence meant nothing without intellectual independence, and that required institutions capable of challenging conventional wisdom. His university proposal was ahead of its time, anticipating the educational needs of a rapidly expanding nation. Sometimes the most important presidential legacies are planted as seeds that bloom long after their planners have passed away. Jefferson's weather obsession. Thomas Jefferson kept daily weather journals with the meticulous precision of a modern meteorologist, recording temperature, precipitation, and atmospheric conditions for decades. His weather observations weren't just hobby. Jefferson believed that understanding climate patterns was essential for agricultural planning and scientific advancement. He maintained detailed records that helped him predict seasonal changes and optimize farming practices at Monticello. Jefferson's weather journals became valuable scientific documents that contributed to early American meteorology and climate understanding. His observations even helped him predict the 1811 New Madrid earthquake patterns, demonstrating how careful data collection could reveal unexpected natural relationships. The weather journals reflected Jefferson's broader belief that systematic observation could unlock nature's secrets and improve human understanding of the natural world. His daily recordings required remarkable discipline and scientific curiosity, treating weather documentation as essential intellectual work rather than casual notation. Jefferson proved that presidential leadership could include contributions to scientific knowledge that outlasted any political achievement. Madison's childless legacy. James Madison never fathered biological children, though he raised his stepson Payne Todd, who became a Revolutionary War hero at the remarkably young age of 16. Madison's childless marriage to Dolly reflected the complex family dynamics of early American politics, where step-parenting was common and biological parenthood wasn't considered essential for political legitimacy. Payne Todd's military service provided Madison with vicarious paternal pride and demonstrated that family bonds could transcend biological relationships. Madison's role as stepfather influenced his political philosophy, particularly his understanding of how societies create and maintain intergenerational connections without relying solely on blood relationships. His experience raising Todd informed his constitutional thinking about how democratic institutions could provide stability across generations of changing leadership. Madison proved that presidential legacies could be intellectual and institutional rather than genetic, passing down ideas and systems rather than DNA. Sometimes the most important inheritance involves principles rather than progeny, and Madison's constitutional framework became his most enduring contribution to future generations. Monroe's imperial costume party, James Monroe, hosted the first White House New Year's levee dressed as a Roman emperor because apparently even early presidents understood the importance of dramatic fashion statements. Monroe's costume choice wasn't random. He wanted to demonstrate that American democracy could embrace classical learning while rejecting European aristocratic pretensions. The Roman emperor outfit allowed Monroe to claim the dignity of ancient republics while avoiding the monarchical symbols that would have scandalized Republican sensibilities. His New Year's levee became an annual White House tradition that combined democratic accessibility with ceremonial grandeur, allowing ordinary citizens to meet their president in extraordinary circumstances. Monroe's costume party reflected his sophisticated understanding of political theater and public ceremony. The emperor outfit was simultaneously playful and profound, suggesting that American leadership could be both approachable and dignified. Monroe's levee demonstrated that democracy required celebration as well as governance, and that presidential leadership sometimes meant knowing how to throw a really good party that honored both tradition and innovation. Quincy Adams's translation. Mission. John. Quincy Adams translated biblical passages into Native American languages as part of his broader anti-slavery crusade, demonstrating intellectual courage that extended far beyond conventional political boundaries. Adams's translation work wasn't missionary activity. It was political strategy designed to strengthen Native American communities and provide them with intellectual tools for resisting forced removal. His linguistic efforts reflected deep respect for Native American cultures and recognition that translation could preserve indigenous knowledge while facilitating cross-cultural communication. Adams believed that providing Native Americans with written religious texts in their own languages would strengthen their legal and moral claims to land and sovereignty. His translation project required learning multiple Native American languages, a considerable intellectual achievement for someone already fluent in Greek, Latin, French, and Dutch. Adams' linguistic work complemented his legal advocacy for Native American rights, providing cultural foundations for his political arguments. Sometimes the most effective political activism involves patient intellectual labor that builds cultural bridges rather than dramatic public gestures. Jackson's card table politics. Andrew Jackson founded the Democratic Party during a casual card game with political cronies, which is perhaps the most appropriately informal origin story for America's oldest political organization. Jackson's party wasn't created through constitutional convention or elaborate political theory. It emerged from practical need and personal friendship, reflecting his direct approach to problem solving. The card game setting perfectly captured Jackson's political style, informal, personal, and focused on winning rather than ideological purity. His Democratic Party represented a fundamental shift toward broader democratic participation and away from elite-dominated politics. Jackson's party founding card game became legendary among his supporters, symbolizing the democratic ideal that important decisions should be made by ordinary people rather than political aristocrats. The informal setting reflected Jackson's belief that politics should be accessible to common citizens rather than reserved for educated elites. His card table democracy challenged existing political establishments and created lasting changes in American political culture. Sometimes the most important institutional innovations emerge from casual conversations rather than formal planning sessions. Van Buren's fashion revolution. Martin Van Buren wore a stunning green velvet coat to his inauguration, launching a fashion trend that scandalized conservatives and delighted fashion-conscious Americans. Van Buren's sartorial choice wasn't accidental. He understood that presidential style carried political significance and used clothing to communicate democratic accessibility combined with refined taste. His green velvet coat suggested prosperity without ostentation, elegance without aristocratic pretension. Van Buren's fashion sense reflected his sophisticated understanding of public image and political symbolism. The green coat became a symbol of democratic dignity that influenced American political fashion for decades. Van Buren's inaugural outfit demonstrated that presidents could embrace beauty and style without abandoning Republican principles. His fashion choices suggested that democracy could be both egalitarian and aesthetically sophisticated. The green velvet coat represented Van Buren's broader political philosophy, that American democracy should be elegant, inclusive, and confident enough to embrace both tradition and innovation. Sometimes the most memorable presidential statements are made through clothing rather than speeches. Harrison's horseback inauguration. William Henry Harrison rode a horse to his inauguration ceremony, rejecting the traditional carriage in favor of a more dramatic and democratic entrance. Harrison's equestrian inauguration reflected his military background and his desire to project strength and accessibility simultaneously. His horse riding entrance suggested that American presidents should be warriors and democrats, comfortable in both military and civilian roles. Harrison's inaugural ride became a symbol of American vigor and democratic energy that contrasted sharply with European ceremonial traditions. His decision to gallop rather than ride sedately in a carriage demonstrated his understanding of political theater and public spectacle. The horseback inauguration reflected Harrison's belief that American presidents should embody frontier virtues rather than aristocratic pretensions. His dramatic entrance set a precedent for presidential inaugurations that emphasized democratic symbolism over formal protocol. Harrison's horse ride suggested that effective leadership required both dignity and dynamic energy, qualities best demonstrated through action rather than ceremony. Sometimes the most important political statements are made through gestures rather than words. Tyler's banking battle. John Tyler vetoed national bank legislation twice, becoming the first president to face impeachment proceedings over fiscal policy disagreements. Tyler's banking vetoes reflected his strict constitutional interpretation and his belief that federal banking power threatened state sovereignty and individual liberty. His double veto demonstrated remarkable political courage, since it alienated both his own party and opposition Democrats, leaving him politically isolated but constitutionally consistent. Tyler's banking battle illustrated the ongoing tension between federal power and states' rights that would define American politics for generations. His veto sparked the first serious impeachment attempt in presidential history, though the effort ultimately failed due to insufficient evidence of actual constitutional violations. Tyler's banking position reflected his broader philosophy that presidential power should be limited and that economic policy should favor local control over centralized authority. His willingness to sacrifice political relationships for constitutional principles established important precedents for presidential independence from party pressure. Sometimes the most important presidential legacies involve saying no rather than yes to popular demands. Polk's Oregon Trail mapping. James K. Polk personally mapped portions of the Oregon Trail, using his surveying expertise to open Western territories for settlement and establish clear territorial boundaries. Polk's mapping work wasn't just geographical. It was strategic planning that facilitated American expansion while avoiding conflicts with British territorial claims. His detailed trail surveys provided settlers with reliable navigation information and helped establish supply stations along dangerous wilderness routes. Polk's mapping efforts reflected his hands-on approach to presidential leadership and his belief that effective governance required detailed knowledge of actual geographical conditions. His Oregon Trail work demonstrated remarkable physical courage, since surveying required extended wilderness travel through hostile territory. Polk's mapping project helped thousands of settlers reach Western destinations safely, contributing to the population growth that secured American territorial claims. His surveying background provided practical skills that enhanced his political leadership, proving that technical expertise could be valuable presidential qualification. Sometimes the most important presidential achievements involve careful preparation rather than dramatic gestures, and Polk's mapping work exemplified the detailed planning that enabled successful Western expansion. Taylor's family connections. Zachary Taylor's daughter Sarah married a relative of Thomas Jefferson, maintaining the intricate family networks that connected America's political elite across generations. Taylor's family marriage alliance reflected the close-knit nature of early American leadership, where personal relationships often influenced political decisions and policy directions. Sarah's marriage created genealogical connections between military and civilian leadership traditions, symbolically uniting different aspects of American political culture. Taylor's family ties to Jefferson suggested continuity between founding principles and contemporary leadership, even as political parties and policies evolved significantly. The marriage alliance demonstrated how early American politics operated through extended family networks that transcended formal party boundaries. Taylor's daughter's marriage reflected the social reality that political leadership often involved multiple generations of the same families, creating informal dynasties based on service rather than hereditary privilege. These family connections provided stability and continuity during periods of rapid political change, ensuring that institutional knowledge passed between generations. Sometimes the most important political relationships are personal rather than professional, and family alliances often prove more durable than party loyalties. Fillmore's German poetry. Millard Fillmore learned German specifically to read Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's poetry in its original language, demonstrating intellectual curiosity that extended far beyond political requirements. Fillmore's linguistic achievement reflected his belief that understanding German literature was essential for comprehending European cultural and philosophical traditions. He would recite Goethe passages during cabinet meetings, using German poetry to illustrate political principles and inspire policy discussions. Fillmore's German studies weren't just personal enrichment, they enhanced his diplomatic effectiveness by allowing him to communicate directly with German speaking visitors and understand European political thought. His poetry recitations became legendary among Washington social circles, where guests would request specific Goethe passages like popular songs. Fillmore's German mastery demonstrated that presidential leadership could include cultural sophistication alongside political acumen. His ability to quote German poetry fluently impressed foreign diplomats and elevated America's cultural reputation among European intellectuals. Sometimes the most effective diplomatic tools involve shared appreciation for literature and art rather than formal negotiations. Fillmore proved that presidents could be both political leaders and cultural ambassadors. Pierce's literary criticism. Franklin Pierce wrote the first presidential book review, analyzing Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter with the critical sophistication of a professional literary scholar. Pierce's review wasn't just friendly support for his college roommate. It was serious literary criticism that demonstrated his intellectual engagement with contemporary American literature. His analysis of Hawthorne's novel explored themes of guilt, redemption, and social judgment that resonated with his own political challenges as president. Pierce's literary criticism reflected his belief that presidents should engage with cultural as well as political developments, understanding that literature shaped public opinion and national identity. His book review established precedent for presidential intellectual engagement beyond purely political matters. Pierce's critical writing demonstrated that political leadership could include cultural commentary and artistic appreciation. His review of The Scarlet Letter provided insights into both literature and politics, suggesting that great novels could illuminate political dilemmas better than policy papers. Sometimes the most revealing presidential documents involve artistic rather than political analysis, and Pierce's literary criticism offered unique insights into his intellectual character. Presidential book reviews proved that democratic leadership required broad cultural engagement. Buchanan's Japanese diplomacy. James Buchanan negotiated the first official treaty between the United States and Japan, opening diplomatic relations that would transform both nations and reshape Pacific politics for generations. Buchanan's Japanese negotiations required extraordinary cultural sensitivity and diplomatic innovation since Japan had maintained strict isolation for over 2 centuries. His treaty included provisions for trade, diplomatic protection, and cultural exchange that respected Japanese sovereignty while securing American commercial interests. Buchanan's diplomatic success involved exchanging samurai gifts and learning Japanese ceremonial protocols that demonstrated American respect for Asian traditions. The treaty negotiations required patience and cultural humility that contrasted sharply with European colonial approaches to Asian relations. Buchanan's Japanese diplomacy established precedents for peaceful international engagement based on mutual respect rather than military coercion. His treaty opened Japan to modernization while preserving Japanese political independence, creating a partnership that would prove crucial during later international crises. Sometimes the most important presidential achievements involve building relationships rather than winning conflicts. And Buchanan's Japanese diplomacy exemplified the patient work required for successful international cooperation that benefits all parties involved. Lincoln's patent innovation. Abraham Lincoln holds the distinction of being the first and only president to hold a patent, demonstrating that his inventive mind extended far beyond politics and law. Patent number 6,469 was granted for a device designed to lift boats over shoals using bellows attached to their sides. Lincoln's invention arose from his personal experience navigating shallow Midwestern rivers, where boats frequently became stranded on sandbars and required laborious manual lifting. His patent application revealed remarkable technical detail and practical engineering knowledge that complemented his legal expertise. Though the device was never manufactured commercially, Lincoln's patent demonstrated his lifelong fascination with mechanical solutions to everyday problems. His inventive spirit reflected the American belief that anyone could improve existing systems through clever innovation and practical experimentation. Lincoln's patent proved that presidential minds could be both political and mechanical, addressing practical challenges with the same analytical approach used for constitutional questions. Johnson's numismatic redemption. Andrew Johnson collected rare coins with the passion of a professional numismatist, amassing a valuable collection that he ultimately donated to the Smithsonian Institution following his impeachment ordeal. Johnson's coin collecting wasn't mere hobby. It was serious scholarship that required extensive historical research and careful authentication of ancient specimens. His collection included Roman coins, early American currency, and rare international pieces that told the story of monetary systems across civilizations. Following his impeachment trial, Johnson's donation to the Smithsonian represented both generous public service and symbolic redemption, transforming personal passion into national educational resource. His numismatic expertise impressed even his political enemies, who acknowledged his genuine scholarly achievement regardless of their opinion about his presidency. Johnson's coin collection demonstrated that intellectual pursuits could provide dignity and purpose even during political disgrace. His Smithsonian donation ensured that his scholarly legacy would outlast his controversial political career, proving that presidents could contribute to national culture through personal expertise as well as official policies. Grant's handcrafted fishing Ulysses S. Grant carved his own fly fishing rod and used it to catch a record trout in Michigan, combining presidential leisure with remarkable personal craftsmanship. Grant's fly rod wasn't just functional equipment, it was artistic achievement that demonstrated his attention to detail and appreciation for traditional woodworking techniques. His fishing expeditions provided essential relaxation from presidential pressures while allowing him to practice skills learned during his military campaigns in wilderness settings. The record trout catch became legendary among fishing enthusiasts, who admired both Grant's technique and his hand-carved equipment. Grant's fly fishing reflected his broader approach to leadership: careful preparation, patient execution, and personal investment in achieving excellence. His handcrafted rod symbolized the American ideal that leaders should maintain practical skills alongside their official responsibilities. Grant's fishing achievements proved that presidential recreation could involve serious craftsmanship and athletic accomplishment rather than mere relaxation. Sometimes the most revealing presidential moments happen in quiet, natural settings rather than formal political environments. Hayes's honest pledge, innovation. Rutherford B. Hayes invented the honest pledge, requiring his staff to swear loyalty oaths on a Bible as part of his comprehensive civil service reform efforts. Hayes's oath system wasn't just ceremonial, it was a practical attempt to restore public trust in government, following the corruption scandals that had plagued previous administrations. His biblical oath requirement reflected his deep religious convictions and his belief that moral accountability was essential for effective governance. Hayes's honest pledge became standard practice for federal employees, establishing precedents for ethical conduct that influenced government service for decades. His oath system demonstrated an innovative approach to institutional reform that combined practical administration with moral authority. Hayes's biblical oaths weren't mere symbolism. They created personal accountability that encouraged ethical behavior among government workers who might otherwise succumb to corrupt temptations. His honest pledge reflected his broader commitment to merit-based government service rather than political patronage systems. Sometimes the most effective institutional reforms involve simple moral commitments rather than complex bureaucratic procedures. Garfield's mental mathematics. James Garfield could calculate the Pythagorean theorem entirely in his head, and demonstrate the proof by drawing geometric diagrams on classroom chalkboards from memory. Garfield's mathematical abilities weren't just academic showing off. They reflected his deep understanding of logical reasoning and systematic problem solving that served him well in political leadership. His mental calculation skills impressed educators and politicians alike, who marveled at his ability to solve complex mathematical problems without written notes or calculating devices. Garfield's mathematical demonstrations became popular entertainment at political gatherings, where audiences would request specific geometric proofs or algebraic solutions. His mental math abilities reflected his broader intellectual approach to political problems, treating policy challenges like mathematical equations that required logical analysis and systematic solutions. Garfield's chalkboard demonstrations proved that presidential minds could be both artistic and analytical, combining creative presentation with rigorous intellectual content. His mathematical skills provided unique perspective on political problems that required both quantitative analysis and intuitive understanding. Sometimes the most effective political leadership involves treating complex problems like mathematical challenges. Arthur's cane collection. Chester A. Arthur collected over 100 antique canes, each featuring historical engravings that told stories of American political and cultural development. Arthur's cane collection wasn't just personal vanity, it was serious historical scholarship that required extensive research into craftsmanship techniques and cultural symbolism. His canes included pieces owned by previous presidents, foreign diplomats, and notable American figures, creating a tangible connection to national history. Arthur's collection reflected his sophisticated understanding of material culture and his appreciation for artistic craftsmanship that combined functionality with aesthetic beauty. His canes became conversation starters during diplomatic meetings, where foreign visitors would examine the engravings and discuss their historical significance. Arthur's collecting demonstrated that presidential interests could include serious antiquarian scholarship alongside political responsibilities. His cane collection provided unique insight into American decorative arts and cultural traditions that might otherwise have been lost to historical obscurity. Sometimes the most important historical preservation happens through personal collecting rather than official institutional efforts. Arthur's canes proved that presidents could be cultural curators as well as political leaders. Cleveland's catch and conscience Grover. Cleveland fished for trout daily during his presidency, but always released his catches, describing his practice as catch and conscience, in a philosophy that reflected his broader approach to ethical leadership. Cleveland's fishing wasn't just recreation, it was moral exercise that reminded him about stewardship, restraint, and the difference between taking what you need versus taking what you can. His daily fishing expeditions provided essential mental relaxation while reinforcing ethical principles that guided his political decision-making. Cleveland's catch-and-release philosophy became a metaphor for his presidential approach. Engage with problems directly, understand them thoroughly, then respond with appropriate restraint rather than excessive force. His fishing practice demonstrated remarkable self-discipline and environmental awareness that was ahead of its time. Cleveland's trout fishing reflected his belief that leadership required both active engagement and moral restraint, knowing when to act and when to step back. His daily fishing ritual provided stability and reflection during turbulent political periods. Sometimes the most important presidential lessons come from quiet, personal practices, rather than dramatic public gestures. Harrison's White House forestry. Benjamin Harrison planted over 50 trees on White House grounds, each one carefully labeled with individual state mottos as part of his vision for national unity and environmental stewardship. Harrison's tree planting wasn't just landscaping, it was a symbolic political statement that represented his belief in federal unity and environmental responsibility. His state motto labels transformed the White House grounds into educational space, where visitors could learn about regional diversity within national unity. Harrison's forestry project required extensive botanical knowledge and careful planning to ensure that trees from different climates could thrive in Washington's environment. His tree labels became popular tourist attraction, allowing visitors to find their home state's representative and read its official motto. Harrison's planning project reflected his broader political philosophy that national strength came from regional diversity rather than uniformity. His labeled trees created lasting monument to American federalism that survived long after his presidency ended. Harrison's forestry work demonstrated that presidential legacy could include environmental stewardship alongside political achievements. Sometimes the most enduring presidential contributions involve patient cultivation rather than dramatic policy initiatives. McKinley's hymn compositions. William McKinley composed religious hymns during his presidency, including arrangements that were performed at significant state occasions and personal family gatherings. McKinley's musical compositions weren't just personal hobby. They reflected his deep religious faith and his belief that music could provide comfort and inspiration during difficult times. His most famous composition was a haunting arrangement of Nearer, My God, to Thee, which was sung at his bedside vigil following the assassination attempt that ultimately claimed his life. McKinley's hymn writing demonstrated remarkable artistic sensitivity and technical musical knowledge that complemented his political skills. His compositions were performed in churches across America, providing lasting cultural contribution that outlived his political career. McKinley's musical legacy reflected his belief that presidents should contribute to national cultural life as well as political governance. His hymn compositions provided spiritual comfort to countless Americans who sang his arrangements during personal and national crises. Sometimes the most meaningful presidential legacies involve artistic creation rather than political legislation. McKinley's music proved that presidential leadership could include cultural as well as political dimensions. Roosevelt's Alpine achievement. Theodore Roosevelt became the first American to climb the Matterhorn without professional guides, demonstrating the physical courage and determination that characterized his entire approach to presidential leadership. Roosevelt's Matterhorn ascent wasn't just recreational adventure, it was calculated risk that proved American mountaineering skills could match European expertise. His solo climbing achievement required months of physical preparation and technical training in advanced mountaineering techniques. Roosevelt's Matterhorn success provided international recognition for American outdoor skills and established precedent for presidential physical fitness that influenced subsequent leaders. His climbing expedition reflected his broader philosophy that leadership required personal courage and willingness to take calculated risks. Roosevelt's Alpine achievement became symbol of American determination and individual excellence that inspired countless citizens to pursue their own ambitious goals. His mountaineering success demonstrated that presidential leadership could include athletic accomplishment alongside political achievement. Roosevelt's Matterhorn climb proved that presidents could be both intellectual leaders and physical exemplars. Sometimes the most inspiring presidential moments involve personal achievement rather than political victory, and Roosevelt's climbing success embodied the American spirit of individual excellence. Taft's baseball arbitration. William Howard Taft umpired baseball games between White House staff teams, occasionally ejecting players for what he diplomatically termed umpire abuse during heated recreational competitions. Taft's umpiring wasn't just presidential entertainment, it was practical demonstration of his judicial temperament and his ability to make fair decisions under pressure. His baseball arbitration skills reflected his legal training and his understanding that effective leadership often involved settling disputes between competing parties. Taft's umpire duties became popular White House tradition that provided staff with recreational outlet while allowing the president to demonstrate his fairness and sense of humor. His willingness to eject argumentative players proved that even presidential umpires must maintain authority and respect for rules. Taft's baseball leadership demonstrated that effective governance could include recreational management alongside serious policy work. His umpiring experience provided valuable practice in conflict resolution and crowd management that served him well in political situations. Sometimes the most important leadership lessons come from managing recreational activities rather than formal political processes. Taft's baseball arbitration proved that presidents could be both authorities and participants in American recreational culture. Wilson's musical composition, Woodrow Wilson composed a violin sonata that was performed at his daughter's wedding, demonstrating musical sophistication that complemented his academic and political achievements. Wilson's composition wasn't just fatherly gesture, it was serious musical work that required advanced understanding of harmonic structure and melodic development. His violin sonata reflected his belief that presidents should contribute to national cultural life through personal artistic creation, as well as policy leadership. Wilson's musical composition provided intimate family moment that revealed his tender personal side during an otherwise intensely political career. His sonata performance became memorable, highlight of his daughter's wedding celebration, creating lasting family legacy that transcended his political accomplishments. Wilson's musical abilities demonstrated that presidential leadership could include artistic expression alongside intellectual and political skills. His violin composition proved that presidents could be both policymakers and cultural creators, contributing to American artistic tradition through personal creativity. Wilson's wedding sonata reflected his understanding that the most important presidential moments often involve personal relationships rather than political achievements. Sometimes the most meaningful leadership involves creating beauty rather than wielding power. Harding's racing addiction. Warren G. Harding bet on horse races daily during his presidency, eventually losing a considerable fortune on his favorite mare named Lady Luck, which proved to be ironically misnamed. Harding's gambling wasn't just casual entertainment, it was serious addiction that reflected his broader pattern of poor personal judgment and risk-taking behavior. His daily betting routine became Washington scandal when reporters discovered the extent of his losses and his emotional attachment to specific horses. Harding's favorite horse, Lady Luck, became symbolic of his entire presidency, promising great success, but ultimately delivering disappointment and financial loss. His racing addiction provided temporary escape from presidential pressures, but created additional stress through mounting gambling debts. Harding's betting losses demonstrated the danger of presidential hobbies that become compulsive behaviors rather than healthy recreation. His gambling problems reflected his difficulty distinguishing between appropriate risk-taking and reckless behavior. Harding's racing addiction proved that presidential weaknesses could undermine both personal finances and political effectiveness. Sometimes the most revealing presidential characteristics involve personal vices rather than public virtues, and Harding's gambling illustrated the importance of self-discipline in leadership positions. Coolidge's secret pottery room. Calvin Coolidge collected Native American pottery with scholarly dedication, displaying his extensive collection in a secret White House room that few visitors ever discovered. Coolidge's pottery collection wasn't just personal interest, it was serious archaeological scholarship that required extensive knowledge of tribal traditions and ceramic techniques. His secret room became a private museum where Coolidge could study Native American artistic traditions and reflect on American cultural history. Coolidge's pottery collecting reflected his deep respect for indigenous artistic achievements and his belief that presidents should preserve cultural treasures for future generations. His secret collection provided quiet retreat where he could escape political pressures while engaging with American artistic heritage. Coolidge's pottery room demonstrated that presidential leadership could include cultural preservation alongside political governance. His collection represented significant financial investment and scholarly commitment that revealed his serious engagement with Native American cultural traditions. Coolidge's secret pottery museum proved that presidents could be both political leaders and cultural stewards. Sometimes the most important presidential contributions involve private scholarship rather than public policy, and Coolidge's pottery collection represented lasting commitment to preserving American cultural diversity. Hoover's engineering legacy. Herbert Hoover personally engineered and surveyed portions of the St. Lawrence Seaway, using his technical expertise to design waterway improvements that would facilitate international commerce for generations. Hoover's engineering work wasn't just professional obligation, it was personal passion that combined his technical training with his vision for American economic development. His seaway surveys required extensive field work in challenging conditions, demonstrating his willingness to engage personally with complex infrastructure projects. Hoover's engineering contributions provided lasting economic benefits that outlived his political career and demonstrated the value of technical expertise in presidential leadership. His seaway work reflected his belief that presidents should contribute practical skills alongside political leadership to national development projects. Hoover's engineering legacy proved that presidential effectiveness could include technical achievement as well as policy innovation. His personal involvement in seaway design demonstrated hands-on leadership approach that combined theoretical knowledge with practical experience. Hoover's engineering work provided foundation for international trade relationships that benefited both American and Canadian economic development. Sometimes the most enduring presidential legacies involve infrastructure improvements rather than political achievements. Roosevelt's wheelchair innovation. Franklin D. Roosevelt designed his own wheelchair and oversaw installation of hidden ramps throughout the White House, demonstrating remarkable ingenuity in adapting presidential facilities for disability accessibility. Roosevelt's wheelchair design wasn't just personal accommodation. It was innovative engineering that improved mobility options for countless disabled Americans. His hidden ramp system transformed White House accessibility while maintaining the building's historical appearance and ceremonial dignity. Roosevelt's wheelchair innovations reflected his determination to prove that physical disability didn't diminish presidential effectiveness or leadership capability. His design improvements provided practical solutions that enhanced his mobility while preserving presidential dignity during public appearances. Roosevelt's accessibility modifications established precedents for accommodation that influenced public building design for decades. His wheelchair engineering demonstrated that presidential leadership could include technological innovation alongside political accomplishment. Roosevelt's hidden ramps proved that effective adaptation often requires creative solutions that address practical needs without compromising institutional traditions. His wheelchair design reflected his broader approach to problem solving, identifying practical challenges and developing innovative solutions that served both personal needs and broader social benefits. Truman's pistol ceremony. Harry S. Truman collected antique pistols and fired a ceremonial weapon at every presidential inauguration, creating unique tradition that combined his military background with constitutional ceremony. Truman's pistol collection wasn't just historical interest. It was serious scholarship that required extensive knowledge of firearms history and manufacturing techniques. His ceremonial firing tradition provided dramatic moment that honored military service while celebrating democratic transitions of power. Truman's pistol expertise reflected his military experience and his appreciation for American craftsmanship in weapons manufacturing. His inaugural firing ceremony became popular tradition that demonstrated presidential respect for military traditions and constitutional processes. Truman's pistol collection provided tangible connection to American military history and demonstrated his ongoing commitment to honoring veteran service. His ceremonial firing tradition created memorable moment that combined historical reverence with celebratory atmosphere. Truman's pistol expertise proved that presidential hobbies could enhance rather than distract from official responsibilities. His inaugural firing ceremony reflected his understanding that effective leadership sometimes requires dramatic gestures that honor tradition while celebrating democratic achievements. Sometimes the most meaningful presidential traditions combine personal interests with constitutional ceremony. Eisenhower's literary ambitions. Dwight D. Eisenhower wrote an unpublished novel about a fictional World War II general, drawing on his military experience to create realistic narrative about leadership challenges during wartime. Eisenhower's novel wasn't just personal project. It was serious literary effort that explored the psychological and moral complexities of military command. His fictional general faced dilemmas similar to those Eisenhower had encountered during the war, providing insight into his decision-making process and leadership philosophy. Eisenhower's literary work remained unpublished because he believed it might compromise his political neutrality or reveal sensitive military information. His novel writing demonstrated remarkable creative ability that complemented his military and political skills. Eisenhower's fictional general became vehicle for exploring leadership themes that he couldn't address directly in his memoirs or public statements. His literary effort proved that presidential minds could be both strategic and creative, combining practical leadership with artistic expression. Eisenhower's unpublished novel reflected his understanding that effective leadership required both analytical thinking and imaginative problem solving. Sometimes the most revealing presidential documents remain private, and Eisenhower's novel provided unique insight into his intellectual and creative capabilities. Kennedy's numismatic diplomacy. John F. Kennedy collected rare coins and frequently gave valuable pieces, including a 1915 Panama Pacific gold coin, to distinguished guests as diplomatic gifts that combined personal passion with international relations. Kennedy's coin collecting wasn't just hobby. It was sophisticated understanding of numismatic history that enhanced his diplomatic effectiveness and cultural knowledge. His gift-giving practice created memorable moments that impressed foreign dignitaries and demonstrated American appreciation for artistic and historical achievements. Kennedy's rare coin gifts reflected his belief that personal diplomacy could be more effective than formal protocol in building international relationships. His numismatic expertise provided conversation starters during diplomatic meetings and demonstrated his appreciation for international cultural traditions. Kennedy's coin collecting proved that presidential interests could enhance rather than distract from official responsibilities. His diplomatic coin gifts created lasting goodwill that outlived his presidency and demonstrated thoughtful approach to international relationship building. Kennedy's numismatic diplomacy reflected his understanding that effective leadership sometimes involves sharing personal passions with others. Sometimes the most successful diplomatic initiatives involve personal gestures rather than formal agreements, and Kennedy's coin gifts exemplified thoughtful cultural exchange. Johnson's Basement Railroad. Lyndon B. Johnson operated a complete model train set in the White House basement, creating an elaborate miniature railroad system that provided relaxation and entertainment during the pressures of presidential leadership. Johnson's train collection wasn't just a recreational hobby. It was a serious engineering project that required detailed planning and mechanical expertise. His basement railroad provided private retreat where he could escape political pressures while engaging in hands-on creative activity. Johnson's model trains reflected his lifelong fascination with transportation systems and his appreciation for detailed craftsmanship and engineering precision. His basement railroad became legendary among White House staff, who would occasionally join the president for informal train operation sessions. Johnson's train collection demonstrated that presidential leadership could include recreational activities that provided essential mental relaxation and creative outlet. His miniature railroad system reflected his understanding that effective governance required balance between intense political work and restorative personal activities. Johnson's basement trains proved that presidents could maintain childlike enthusiasm alongside adult responsibilities. Sometimes the most important presidential moments involve play rather than work, and Johnson's model railroad provided essential psychological balance during turbulent political periods. Nixon's philatelic espionage. Richard Nixon collected rare stamps with obsessive dedication, once trading a stamp worth $100,000 for what he claimed was a valuable peace negotiation hint. Nixon's stamp collecting wasn't mere hobby. It was strategic intelligence gathering that combined personal passion with diplomatic advantage. His rare stamp trades created informal diplomatic channels that bypassed traditional foreign policy protocols. Nixon's philatelic expertise impressed international collectors and provided unique opportunities for confidential conversations with foreign officials. His stamp collection became legendary among Washington insiders who understood that Nixon's trading activities often concealed serious political negotiations. The $100,000 stamp trade demonstrated Nixon's willingness to sacrifice valuable personal possessions for potential political gains. His collecting activities proved that presidential hobbies could serve dual purposes as both recreation and statecraft. Sometimes the most important diplomatic breakthroughs happen through shared collecting interests rather than formal negotiations. Ford's automotive nostalgia. Gerald Ford collected antique cars with the enthusiasm of a professional restoration specialist, personally driving a 1925 Model T in presidential parades, despite Secret Service concerns about safety. Ford's automotive collection wasn't just nostalgic hobby, it was serious mechanical scholarship that required extensive knowledge of early automotive technology and restoration techniques. His Model T parade appearances provided memorable public moments that connected modern presidency with automotive history. Ford's car collecting reflected his appreciation for American industrial innovation and his hands-on approach to understanding mechanical systems. His antique car restoration work provided relaxing escape from political pressures while maintaining connection to practical craftsmanship. Ford's Model T driving demonstrated his willingness to embrace risk for symbolic value and public connection. His automotive expertise proved that presidential leadership could include technical knowledge alongside political skills. Sometimes the most effective presidential symbolism involves embracing historical continuity rather than promoting innovation. Carter's archaeological passion. Jimmy Carter collected arrowheads on his Georgia farm, discovering over 1,000 Native American artifacts that provided tangible connection to pre-Columbian history and indigenous culture. Carter's arrowhead collecting wasn't just casual hobby. It was serious archaeological work that required extensive knowledge of Native American cultural traditions and artifact identification techniques. His farm discoveries contributed to scholarly understanding of indigenous settlement patterns in Georgia and demonstrated his respect for Native American heritage. Carter's collection reflected his lifelong commitment to learning and his appreciation for cultures that preceded European settlement. His arrowhead hunting provided peaceful recreation that connected him to Georgia's natural environment and cultural history. Carter's archaeological discoveries proved that presidential leisure activities could contribute to historical knowledge and cultural understanding. His Native American artifact collection demonstrated personal commitment to preserving indigenous heritage. Sometimes the most meaningful presidential contributions involve patient scholarship rather than dramatic policy initiatives, and Carter's arrowhead collecting exemplified quiet dedication to historical preservation. Reagan's Hollywood memories. Ronald Reagan collected signed movie posters from his Hollywood career, displaying them prominently in the Lincoln bedroom where visiting dignitaries could appreciate his entertainment industry background. Reagan's poster collection wasn't just personal vanity. It was a strategic reminder of his unique path to presidential power through popular culture and entertainment success. His Lincoln bedroom displays created conversation starters that helped foreign visitors understand American celebrity culture and democratic accessibility. Reagan's movie memorabilia reflected his pride in entertainment achievements and his belief that Hollywood experience provided valuable preparation for political leadership. His poster collection demonstrated that presidential legitimacy could come from popular success rather than traditional political credentials. Reagan's Hollywood displays proved that entertainment background could enhance rather than diminish presidential authority. His movie posters created unique atmosphere that combined historical gravitas with popular culture accessibility. Sometimes the most effective presidential symbolism involves embracing unconventional backgrounds rather than conforming to traditional expectations, and Reagan's poster collection celebrated his distinctive pathway to power. Bush Sr.'s Presidential Shrine. George H.W. Bush collected presidential memorabilia with scholarly dedication, eventually acquiring Abraham Lincoln's original inkwell, along with artifacts from multiple previous administrations. Bush's presidential collecting wasn't just historical interest, it was serious scholarship that demonstrated deep respect for institutional continuity and democratic traditions. His Lincoln inkwell represented tangible connection to presidential history and provided daily reminder of leadership responsibilities. Bush's memorabilia collection reflected his understanding that effective presidency required appreciation for historical precedent and institutional wisdom. His presidential artifacts created an informal museum that educated visitors about American democratic traditions. Bush's collecting demonstrated that presidential leadership could include cultural stewardship alongside political governance. His Lincoln inkwell provided symbolic reminder that contemporary presidents inherit legacy of previous leaders. Sometimes the most important presidential qualities involve reverence for historical continuity rather than revolutionary innovation, and Bush's memorabilia collection exemplified respectful engagement with democratic traditions and institutional heritage. Clinton's musical arsenal. Bill Clinton collected vintage saxophones, including a pristine 1920s model that he played during informal White House gatherings and state dinner entertainment. Clinton's saxophone collection wasn't just musical hobby, it was serious appreciation for jazz history and American musical traditions that enhanced his cultural diplomacy. His vintage instruments provided authentic sound quality that impressed professional musicians and created memorable entertainment moments. Clinton's saxophone playing became signature presidential characteristic that distinguished his administration and demonstrated his connection to American popular culture. His instrument collection reflected his deep understanding of music theory and his appreciation for craftsmanship in musical instrument manufacturing. Clinton's saxophone performances created relaxed atmosphere during formal diplomatic events and provided unique presidential entertainment. His musical abilities proved that presidential talents could include artistic expression alongside political skills. Sometimes the most effective diplomatic moments involve shared appreciation for music rather than formal negotiations, and Clinton's saxophone performances created lasting cultural connections. Bush Jr.'s boot collection. George W. amassed over 200 pairs of custom cowboy boots, each pair meticulously monogrammed and representing different occasions, states, or diplomatic visits during his presidency. Bush's boot collection wasn't just Western fashion statement, it was serious commitment to American regional culture and authentic expression of his Texas identity. His monogrammed boots became conversation pieces during international meetings where foreign leaders would examine the craftsmanship and cultural significance. Bush's boot collection reflected his belief that presidential authenticity required embracing regional identity rather than adopting generic political persona. His custom boots demonstrated appreciation for American artisanal traditions and provided connection to Western cultural heritage. Bush's boot collecting proved that presidential style could be both personal and symbolic, representing broader cultural values. His monogram collection created unique presidential signature that distinguished his administration and demonstrated commitment to authentic self-expression. Sometimes the most effective presidential symbolism involves embracing regional identity rather than conforming to Washington conventions, and Bush's boot collection celebrated distinctively American cultural traditions. Obama's literary treasures, Barack Obama collected signed books from notable authors and world leaders, including a personally inscribed volume from Nelson Mandela following Obama's Nobel Peace Prize recognition. Obama's book collecting wasn't just intellectual hobby, it was serious engagement with global thought leaders and literary traditions that enhanced his understanding of international perspectives. His Mandela inscription represented personal connection to moral leadership and democratic struggle that influenced his presidential philosophy. Obama's signed book collection reflected his lifelong commitment to learning and his appreciation for intellectual achievement across cultures. His literary treasures provided inspiration during challenging political moments and demonstrated his respect for wisdom from diverse sources. Obama's book collecting proved that presidential leadership could include ongoing intellectual growth through engagement with great minds. His signed volumes created a personal library that combined political education with literary appreciation. Sometimes the most important presidential influences come from books rather than advisors, and Obama's collection demonstrated his commitment to lifelong learning and intellectual curiosity throughout his political career. Trump's timepiece diplomacy. Donald Trump collected luxury gold watches, including diamond-encrusted timepieces that he wore to international summits as symbols of American prosperity and business success. Trump's watch collection wasn't just personal luxury. It was a strategic communication tool that projected wealth and success during diplomatic negotiations. His diamond watches became conversation starters with foreign leaders who appreciated fine craftsmanship and understood luxury symbolism. Trump's timepiece collection reflected his belief that presidential image should project strength and success rather than modest public service. His luxury watches demonstrated appreciation for precision craftsmanship and international luxury manufacturing. Trump's watch collecting proved that presidential style could be both personal expression and diplomatic strategy. His diamond timepieces created unique presidential signature that distinguished his administration and communicated specific values. Sometimes the most effective presidential symbolism involves projecting strength through luxury rather than modesty, and Trump's watch collection represented his distinctive approach to presidential image and international relationship building through displays of prosperity. Biden's bicycle heritage. Joe Biden collected vintage bicycles, including a pristine 1950s Schwinn that he regularly rode around his Rehoboth Beach property for exercise and nostalgic recreation. Biden's bicycle collecting wasn't just fitness equipment, it was connection to simpler times and appreciation for classic American manufacturing and design traditions. His vintage Schwinn represented post-war optimism and provided peaceful recreation that connected him to childhood memories. Biden's bicycle collection reflected his appreciation for enduring quality and his commitment to maintaining physical fitness throughout his political career. His vintage bikes demonstrated understanding that effective leadership required both mental sharpness and physical vitality. Biden's bicycle riding provided public symbol of active aging and a healthy lifestyle that inspired older Americans. His Schwinn collection proved that presidential recreation could be both personally meaningful and publicly inspirational. Sometimes the most effective presidential symbolism involves embracing simple pleasures rather than complex luxury, and Biden's bicycle collecting demonstrated appreciation for classic American values and healthy living. Washington's agricultural innovation. But our founding fathers weren't content with just collecting. They were inventors and innovators too. George Washington invented a horse-drawn plow that significantly boosted crop yields at Mount Vernon, demonstrating his practical approach to agricultural improvement and economic development. Washington's plow design wasn't just farming equipment, it was technological innovation that reflected his belief that American prosperity required agricultural advancement and scientific progress. His improved plow design influenced farming techniques throughout Virginia and provided practical demonstration of presidential leadership in economic development. Washington's agricultural invention proved that political leadership could include technological contribution to national prosperity. His plow innovation reflected his understanding that effective governance required practical solutions to economic challenges. Washington's farming improvements provided foundation for American agricultural development and demonstrated presidential commitment to economic progress. Sometimes the most important presidential contributions involve practical innovation rather than political rhetoric, and Washington's plow invention exemplified his commitment to improving American economic productivity. Adams's wind power pioneer. John Adams built a windmill on his Massachusetts farm to grind corn for Continental Army soldier rations, demonstrating early commitment to renewable energy and practical support for military logistics. Adams's windmill wasn't just farming equipment. It was strategic contribution to Revolutionary War effort that combined personal resources with patriotic service. His wind-powered grain processing provided essential food supplies for troops, while demonstrating innovative approach to energy utilization. Adams's windmill reflected his understanding that political independence required economic self-sufficiency and technological innovation. His wind power experiment proved that environmental stewardship could enhance rather than conflict with economic productivity. Adams's windmill construction demonstrated hands-on leadership that combined theoretical knowledge with practical implementation. His renewable energy project provided foundation for American agricultural independence and proved presidential commitment to sustainable development. Sometimes the most prescient presidential initiatives involve environmental innovation rather than short-term political gains, and Adams's windmill demonstrated early understanding of renewable energy potential. Jefferson's brewing experiments. Thomas Jefferson brewed his own beer at Monticello, developing a special recipe for Monticello ale that combined his scientific curiosity with practical household management and entertaining needs. Jefferson's brewing wasn't just personal consumption. It was scientific experimentation that reflected his systematic approach to improving daily life through careful observation and methodical refinement. His beer recipe development required understanding fermentation, chemistry, and agricultural science that enhanced his broader scientific knowledge. Jefferson's brewing experiments provided practical application of his theoretical learning and demonstrated presidential engagement with everyday domestic activities. His Monticello ale became popular among visitors who appreciated both the quality and the presidential craftsmanship behind its production. Jefferson's brewing proved that presidential interests could include practical arts alongside intellectual pursuits. His beer making demonstrated that effective leadership required understanding both grand political theories and simple practical skills. Sometimes the most revealing presidential activities involve domestic rather than political accomplishments, and Jefferson's brewing exemplified his commitment to excellence in every aspect of life. Madison's silk industry failure. James Madison smuggled silkworms into America, attempting to establish domestic silk industry. Though his ambitious project failed spectacularly despite considerable personal investment and careful planning. Madison's silkworm venture wasn't just economic experiment. It was strategic attempt to reduce American dependence on imported luxury goods and demonstrate agricultural diversification possibilities. His silk project required extensive research into sericulture techniques and careful cultivation of mulberry trees for silkworm feeding. Madison's silkworm smuggling reflected his belief that American economic independence required domestic production of previously imported goods. His silk industry failure provided valuable lessons about agricultural experimentation and the challenges of introducing new crops to American conditions. Madison's silkworm project proved that presidential innovation sometimes involves spectacular failures alongside notable successes. His silk experiment demonstrated willingness to take calculated risks for potential national economic benefits. Sometimes the most instructive presidential projects involve ambitious failures rather than safe successes, and Madison's silkworm adventure exemplified the experimental spirit that characterized early American development. Monroe's fossil discoveries. James Monroe collected fossils during his travels, eventually donating a mastodon bone to early American museums as contribution to emerging scientific institutions and paleontological research. Monroe's fossil collecting wasn't just personal hobby, it was serious scientific contribution that advanced American understanding of natural history and geological development. His mastodon bone donation provided valuable research material for early American scientists and demonstrated presidential support for scientific education. Monroe's paleontological interest reflected his belief that presidential leadership should include cultural and scientific stewardship alongside political governance. His fossil collection proved that presidents could contribute to scientific knowledge through personal scholarship and generous donation to public institutions. Monroe's museum donations established precedent for presidential cultural philanthropy and demonstrated commitment to educational advancement. His paleontological work provided foundation for American scientific research and proved that presidential interests could enhance national intellectual development. Sometimes the most enduring presidential legacies involve scientific contribution rather than political achievement, and Monroe's fossil collecting exemplified commitment to advancing human knowledge. Quincy Adams' silkworm revival. John Quincy Adams also bred silkworms, spinning their thread into silk cravats that he wore proudly as symbols of American industrial potential and personal craftsmanship achievement. Adams' silkworm project wasn't just fashion statement, it was practical demonstration of domestic manufacturing possibilities and presidential commitment to economic independence. His hand-spun silk cravats provided tangible proof that American production could match European quality and demonstrated presidential willingness to support domestic industry through personal example. Adams's silk spinning required considerable skill and patience that reflected his broader approach to careful, methodical problem solving in political and personal endeavors. His silkworm breeding proved that presidential interests could include both intellectual pursuits and practical manufacturing skills. Adams' silk cravats created unique presidential signature that combined fashion with political symbolism. His silkworm success demonstrated that agricultural experimentation could achieve practical results through persistent effort and scientific approach. Sometimes the most effective presidential symbolism involves wearing the fruits of domestic innovation rather than imported luxury. Jackson's notched walking sticks. Andrew Jackson collected walking sticks carved with notches representing his numerous dueling victories, creating a portable tally of personal combat achievements that accompanied him throughout his political career. Jackson's notched canes weren't just mobility aids. They were intimidating reminders of his willingness to defend personal honor through violence and his remarkable survival record in deadly encounters. His dueling notches provided visual evidence of his reputation and served as deterrent to potential challengers who might otherwise question his courage or resolve. Jackson's carved sticks reflected his belief that personal honor required physical courage, and that political authority derived partly from demonstrated willingness to fight. His notched canes became legendary among political opponents who understood that challenging Jackson meant risking personal combat with a proven survivor. Jackson's walking stick collection proved that presidential authority could include physical intimidation alongside political persuasion. His dueling notches created unique presidential signature that combined practical necessity with psychological warfare. Sometimes the most effective political authority involves implied physical threat rather than legal coercion. Van Buren's campaign fashion. Martin Van Buren collected campaign ribbons from his various political contests, wearing them as fashionable lapel pins that transformed political memorabilia into personal style statements and conversation starters. Van Buren's ribbon collection wasn't just political nostalgia, It was strategic fashion choice that communicated his Democratic credentials and connection to popular political movements. His ribbon pins provided visible reminder of his electoral success and demonstrated his comfort with Democratic participation rather than aristocratic appointment. Van Buren's campaign accessories reflected his understanding that political success required both policy expertise and popular appeal demonstrated through symbolic identification with voter movements. His ribbon wearing proved that presidential style could include political messaging alongside personal fashion preferences. Van Buren's campaign pins created unique presidential signature that combined democratic symbolism with elegant personal presentation. His ribbon collection demonstrated that effective political leadership required understanding both policy substance and popular symbolism. Sometimes the most successful political communication involves fashion choices rather than formal speeches, and Van Buren's ribbon pins exemplified subtle but effective political messaging. Harrison's ceremonial swords. William Henry Harrison collected military swords and used them ceremonially to cut inaugural ribbons, combining his military background with civilian presidential duties through symbolic blade usage. Harrison's sword collection wasn't just military memorabilia, it was practical demonstration of his warrior credentials and his ability to bridge military and civilian leadership traditions. His ceremonial sword usage provided visual reminder of his military service while adapting martial symbols for peaceful democratic purposes. Harrison's sword-cutting ceremonies created memorable public moments that honored military tradition while celebrating democratic transitions. His sword collection proved that presidential authority could include military symbolism without threatening civilian government. Harrison's ceremonial blade usage demonstrated that effective leadership sometimes required dramatic gestures that combined historical reverence with contemporary celebration. His sword ceremonies created unique presidential tradition that honored both military service and democratic governance. Sometimes the most effective presidential symbolism involves adapting military traditions for peaceful political purposes, and Harrison's sword ceremonies exemplified successful integration of martial and civilian authority. Pierce's poetic seashells. Franklin Pierce collected seashells during his coastal travels, mailing them to friends along with original poems that described their natural beauty and geological significance. Pierce's shell collecting wasn't just beachcombing. It was scientific observation combined with artistic expression that reflected his appreciation for natural beauty and poetic communication. His shell-themed poetry provided unique correspondence that combined presidential prestige with personal artistic creation. Pierce's poetic shells demonstrated his ability to find inspiration in simple natural objects and transform scientific observation into artistic expression. His shell collection proved that presidential interests could include both natural history and creative writing that enhanced personal relationships. Pierce's shell poems created memorable gifts that combined scientific education with artistic beauty. His seashell correspondence demonstrated that effective leadership could include personal artistic expression alongside official political communication. Sometimes the most meaningful presidential relationships involve sharing simple natural beauty rather than complex political ideas, and Pierce's shell poems exemplified gentle personal diplomacy through artistic appreciation of nature. Buchanan's diplomatic seals. James Buchanan collected diplomatic seals from his extensive international service, using them to stamp his personal holiday cards as unique presidential tradition that combined official symbolism with personal correspondence. Buchanan's seal collection wasn't just diplomatic memorabilia, it was professional archive that documented his extensive international experience and provided tangible connection to global diplomatic traditions. His holiday card stamping created distinctive presidential signature that impressed recipients and demonstrated his appreciation for ceremonial protocol. Buchanan's diplomatic seals reflected his understanding that Effective leadership required both formal authority and personal relationship building through thoughtful communication. His seal collection proved that presidential experience could include extensive international service that enhanced understanding of global perspectives. Buchanan's holiday stamping demonstrated that diplomatic protocol could be adapted for personal use without diminishing official dignity. His seal collection created unique presidential tradition that combined professional authority with personal warmth. Sometimes the most effective presidential communication involves adapting official symbols for personal relationship building, and Buchanan's stamped holiday cards exemplified thoughtful integration of diplomatic experience with personal correspondence. And there you have it, 101 absolutely true, completely verified, wonderfully weird facts about the people who've held the most important job in America. From Washington's agricultural inventions to Biden's vintage bicycle collection, these stories remind us that even the most powerful leaders in human history were fundamentally just people. People who made mistakes, pursued odd hobbies, and occasionally got into knife fights over stolen goats. The next time you see a presidential portrait hanging solemnly in some government building, just remember that dignified figure probably had a secret hobby involving either rare stamps, antique canes, or model trains in the basement. They worried about library finds, composed poetry, and yes, sometimes hidden trees when things got complicated. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, be thankful you're not responsible for running a country while simultaneously maintaining a collection of over 50 fedoras. Sweet dreams, and remember, history is always stranger than we imagine. Sleep tight.